Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for coming back. Today, we're going to continue on our meat industry side of things. We're going to talk about beef yield grading and beef yield grading, and we'll do a little bit of practice as well. Just run through some numbers. Yield grading, once you have all the facts, is literally a numbers game. There's a formula. You just plug in numbers and you let the math tell you what it is, and there's a little bit of judgment call later. Not near as bad as the beef industry, as the beef quality grading, but it's still there. So if we look at yield grading, we ask ourselves, well, what's yield grades? It's another way for us to break down grades of beef to numerical groups that will have similar cut abilities. Now, in essence, that basically just tells us that yield grades give us the overall cutability of beef. And if we look at the definition of cutability, it is actually the percentage of boneless, closely trimmed retail cuts a carcass will yield. So if we look at cutability tells us basically, essentially, how many pounds of product we could get out of an animal that you could see at a retail establishment. Walmart, HEB, doesn't matter where you're going. It's just a way for us to segment the industry even more. So we have quality, which is eating quality, and then we have yield grading, which is basically how much red meat yield that animal is going to produce that will actually go into the food chain for human consumption. So if we look at yield grades, we can have a yield grade of 1 being the smallest or the trimmest carcass out there, or we can go all the way to 5. And yield grade 5 is the largest. We can go to a 5.9 on the scale. Can't go over 6. If it is a 6, it would be recorded as a 5.9 or 5.9, and would be considered very, very wasty or fat or excessively fat on the scale. So if we look at the different parts of a yield grades basically have 4 different parts. Now this is something that will show up on an exam coming forward. Should be your final exam, and so this is definitely something to look into. The first one is preliminary yield grade. We also denote that as PYG. Ribeye area, we signalize that as REA. Hot carcass weight, HCW. And kidney, pelvic, and heart fat, KPH. Now, PYG, or preliminary yield grade, is something we can actually measure for. And there's an equation that equates over to another number that we use. Ribeye area, we can literally measure the longissimus dorsi muscle that is presented to us within a carcass. The hot carcass weight, that's what the animal weighed after it's been dressed. So all the hides removed, all the internal organs, all the offal or the drop is removed out of the carcass, and that's what it weighs when it's hot. When it comes off the harvest room floor, that carcass is still going to be running probably 80-90 degrees in degrees Fahrenheit, and we get a weight right then. That's what we call our hot carcass weight, because once we chill down, we start to lose moisture. And that's part of the aging process to help increase palatability, but that's for another day. Then we also look at the amount of kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. KPH, or kidney, pelvic, and heart fat, we look at that and we see how much is there, and we try to estimate what percent of the carcass weight is that fat, because our kidney fat can be very large, and it can definitely alter our grades a little bit. So we want to make sure that we have the option to work on our numbers a little bit. So the first part of the equation we always look for is the preliminary yield grade, or PYG. And for us to actually determine the amount of PYG there is, we look at the fat opposite the ribeye between the 12th and 13th ribs. And this is the starting place or the starting value for our yield grade. So this is always the first thing we always try to get when we're trying to do this. We have to remember that in the industry, the folks that are doing this for a living, and they're part of this, they're part of the group that's working every day. This is where they start every time. They look at how much fat's opposite the 12th and 13th ribeye. That's where we rib beef carcasses. That's very good test question right there. But we look at the amount of external fat all there, and we'll see a picture coming up. So as we look at the picture of this ribeye right here, here's our chine bone right here on the bottom. Here, that's actually the spinal, where the spinal cord will lay. So here is where the other half of the carcass would have been attached. This side here, the side with the yellow mark, is actually the external side, be the outside where the hide was. And if we look right here, this is actually the inside of the rib cage. So a rib actually runs right here. This is one of the many intercostal muscles that are within a carcass. And so if we look right here, we need to make sure we get our origin, our basis right for where we're going to start everything from. So the first thing I always try to do when I try to get my PYG is, because we look at it we try to find three quarters of the way up the ribeye, which is where this little yellow mark is. So first thing I always do, cut it in half, right? That gives us 50-50. And then we cut the top half of what we're looking at. So if we put where this other line is right here, that's actually, if we cut that in half, that's actually 75%, or 3/4 of the way up the ribeye. So we go up the ribeye looking away from you. And here, this little white line, that's actually the yellow line, excuse me, that's actually where we measure for us to be able to look at that and to get our initial measurement off the carcass. Now there's the longissimus dorsi muscle. This would be the same muscle we would have used for beef quality grading as well. So whenever we get to that point, we look at it or we measure it, and we come up with how many tenths of an inch. 0 all the way up to 7/10 of an inch. So if we go over 7, for every 1/10 of an inch we go over, we increase it by 0.25. So if we just start at 2. So we know that when we get to 3, we have a basis of 2. We get to 0.75, so each one we go up will go to 2.75. So if you had 3/10 of an inch of fat where that little bitty yellow line is, we would have our PYG would be 2.75. Now all of these, this would make a very good test question for you to try to look at and try to figure out a way to look at it. So if we look at if we go to the next part of the equation, is the ribeye area, or the REA. The ribeye area is determined by the amount of exposed lean in the ribeye, and this is the muscle that we've been talking about that's called the longissimus dorsi. We base all our industry stuff, a lot of the carcass value off of this one muscle, and it's very important for us to realize atomically which one it is. So if we look at this picture right here, here's our ribeye area where the gray is. It's a little shifted over a little bit, but you get the point that it's basically everywhere that you would basically affect where marbling is if we were thinking about to our beef quality grading. Anywhere we figure that we would figure marbling scores off of, it's the same place we would figure for longissimus dorsi area. So there's actually a grid, a little clear plexiglass grid we can put over and count dots and tell us the actual number. So we count the number of dots, and that's 1/10 of an inch, and so 10 of those make an inch, 1 square inch, and that gives us the second number that we need within our second or third equation we need in there. Second by the list we're going off of. So once we get that, we actually adjust the ribeye area because of weight. Excuse me. We don't adjust it because of weight. We adjust it because in the industry we have a basis. Our basis is an 11 square inch ribeye. That is what we figure the average is for a 600 pound carcass, which we'll see next. But in this formula right here, so if we look at the formula, we figure out how big of a ribeye area we have, and we place that number into where the REA is. So if we look on the bottom line of that, we have an 11 square inch basis minus that by 12 square inch. That's an actual number. We come up with -1 there. We times that by 0.3, and we actually equal -0.3. So that's a deduct we will take off of the actual ribeye area, because the more ribeye area we have should tell us that carcass exposes a higher possibility to produce more red meat product. Now if we would put a 10 where that 12 is, that 10 we would actually add to it, because that carcass should be a lighter muscled carcass according to the size of that ribeye. So we're saying with the 12-inch ribeye and taking off 0.3 of our PYG that we'll look at later, that's actually telling us that carcass should give us more pounds, a higher percentage of closely trimmed retail cuts. So that's why when you do the numbers, you enter it in your calculator just the way it lays, and that's why we get a -3 or -1 times that by 0.3, and then we get to the correct number. So if we look at hot carcass weight, this is something that is given to us, but it's the weight of the dressed carcass. And a lot of times in the industry, this is actually on a tag attached to the carcass. Now you can find a lot of other information on that tag. There's going to be a lot number. So that lot number, we can actually trace that animal back to the date it was harvested if it would follow it all the way through. So we do have some traceability through this process, through the steps, just in case something goes wrong. And it also tells us the volume, how heavy it is. It can tell us, a lot of packers will put a lot of other information on there. But the main thing you need to really worry about on that tag is the hot carcass weight. Lot number doesn't matter. They're going to sling carcasses at you all day if you're doing this for a living. Doesn't matter what lot number it is. You're gonna grade carcasses every day, all day. So that's the name of the game. But if we look at hot carcass weight, we get that number off the tag. We take our hot carcass weight, minus that by 600, times that by 0.004, and that is our hot carcass weight adjustment. So if it's a plus or minus, that determines if we add to the actual PYG or we take away for our final yield grade. So if we look right here at our hot carcass weight, we have 800. We have an 800 pound carcass. So our 600 pound is our basis. We figure an average of a 600 pound carcass should have an 11-inch square ribeye. So that's why we come up the 600 and the 11 that we used before. And that's why when we put 800 minus 600, 200 times that by 0.004, and we come up with an adjustment of plus 0.8. That's a positive number, so we'll add that to the number overall. So with our hot carcass weight adjustment, that's going to tell us that because it's a bigger carcass, we should get more pounds of product off of it, right? We're expecting it to be there. Now, if we look at KPH, this is where probably a little bit of a judgment call comes in. Yes, we could remove it all and weigh it and get an actual number. But when you're grading carcasses, they're coming through at a chain speed of probably a carcass per 30 seconds. So it's a pretty fast process. So there's no time to remove it and weigh it and try to equate the information that way. So we look at it as it's going by, and we estimate what it is. But it determines by the percent of fat located in the kidney, pelvic, and heart regions of the actual carcass. And we're going to see a picture of that right now. So our pelvic fat is up here. So we got to remember, this is the hind leg of an animal. This is actually the shoulder. So the head would actually be attached right here if that animal is still alive. And so our pelvic fat up here, our pelvis, our hip bone, that's where it's at. Our kidney is actually inside this cavity. So we actually kind of got to look up in there and try to estimate how much is there. But typically in the industry, the kidney is still attached. Now, heart fat, just like on all of us, our heart is pretty much very close to our sternum and our chest cavity, protected by our rib cage. Well, beef cattle and sheep and goats and pigs are all the same way. So we look at the amount of heart fat. Now, we can see the heart fat. We see those big white globs, 2 globs of fat right there. That's what we consider heart fat. We can see some pelvic fat right here. This one's fair to middling, nothing too outrageous out there, but it's definitely a number we need in our equation. So if we look at the weight of the carcass, if we look at, we look at it, we try to estimate how much fat is there. We weigh it. Every softball size of fat that we notice is basically 8 pounds. And so a pound, and that every softball size up there, we take that and we equate that down into a percentage basis for the actual kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. So when we do that, we figure, let's say we have a kpH we're going to expect at 2.0. Well, our adjustment for a 2.0 kpH is actually going to be a negative 0.3. So we're going to take off of that actual yield grade because that is fat that is taken away from the high carcass weight, for one. Okay, it's processed somewhere else, and it has no bearing in the industry, right? Like we can sell fat, we can sell tallow. That's what beef fat really is when you buy tallow to fry things in or to cook with or bake with. Well, we want to take that off the carcass. We don't want that to be a deduct against the carcass, so we take that off of a negative 0.3. But once we get up here into the 4s and 5s, that's probably going to give us a good indication that that animal is extremely fat. If we're looking at percent kpH, so we could be on the plus side of things, adding to it, because that's going to tell us that that animal is extremely fat as well. So there's a correlation to how excessively fat an animal is, how much condition that animal has going forward, according to how much kpH is there. So we need to keep that in mind when we look at that actual equation. So if we look at the beef yield grade in review, here's everything that we do. Okay, we find the actual PYG, find that number. Then we list out our ribeye adjustment. If it is a plus, we add in our hot carcass weight. If it is a plus, might be a minus. And same thing with the kpH, kidney, pelvic, and heart fat. We put that in. So we put that in with if it's a positive number or a negative number. So do we add it or take it away from the PYG? And then we come up with our overall yield grade. That number should be between 1 and 5.9. Can't go to 6, can't go to 0.9. It's either a 1 or a 5.9, which would basically be a 5 if we look at it. Very extremely heavy fat carcass, excessively fat, and we actually, those carcasses actually get discounted on a price value because there's so much fat. The industry is in the market to sell beef, not fat. Consumers do not buy real fatty pieces of meat. You go to a grocery store and you find, if you would stay in there long enough, people would pass up a piece of meat that would have a ton of excessive fat on it because they think that, one, it looks more unhealthy. Okay, that's the big thing, and two, they want to buy red meat. They're buying meat, they're buying a high value product, and fat is not a high value product. It's a lower value. It does have a value, it has a significance in the industry, but the consumer doesn't want to buy that. So let's look at our actual practice. So what we're going to do here, I'm going to put the practice up. I'm going to give you just a few seconds to go through the numbers, and then you can pause this video, please feel free to, and we're going to pause the video in between each one, and then we'll talk about all the equations going through, and we'll talk about what that final number looks like and where it may fit within the industry. So here's your first practice. All right, so we have, if we take all those numbers and we think about all of our adjustments we talked about before, and we want to go ahead and put numbers next to those, here's what we end up with. Okay, we end up with a PYG of 3.3, a ribeye area of minus 0.5. So we have to remember that it had a larger ribeye, so that carcass is going to be a little leaner. Hot carcass weight of 0.5. If we toggle back, 725 pounds, so a lot heavier type carcass. And if we look at the KPH, 3%, pretty standard for the industry at 2 to 3%. Going to be -1 or -2 on the KPH. And we end up with a yield grade of 3.2. So if you do the math, we start out with 3.3. Basically, the 2.5s cancel each other out because -5 minus 0.5 plus 0.5 equals 0, right? So that's nothing. So we have a -1 adjustment for the KPH that brings it down to a 3.2. So 3.2 is a very good yield grade for the industry. We don't want them super trim because those carcasses don't grade typically for the quality grade, producing a high-end product for the consumer. But 3 is acceptable. 2s and 3s is kind of where it's at. Typically those carcasses should have enough external fat to tell us that they should grade good enough on the quality scale as well. So there is a correlation to each other. So here's practice number 2. I'm going to pause just for a few seconds. All right, so we have all these numbers. We want to put some actual thought behind them. And so here we go. We have a PYG of 4.0, pretty fat. He's looking like a fat carcass at 4.0, and we'll see some actual pictures of some carcasses that would fit into these scales going through. So these are just hypothetical numbers we're looking at. But ribeye area is plus 0.2. Gonna help. It's a bigger carcass. It's gonna be a smaller ribeye. Small 10-inch ribeye. Gonna be quite a bit smaller. Hot carcass weight is 1.0. Add that to it, and we take away 0.2. So with all those changes, we end up with a 5.0, right? So the 2s cancel each other out, and then we add a 1 full point. On the PYG, we end up with 5.0. 5.0 carcass in the industry is going to be a pretty fat carcass. We're going to see that it's going to produce a lesser amount of closely trimmed retail cuts available to the public by this number. And I would expect that with having a 10 square inch ribeye as well. So here's our third practice and our final practice for today, and we're going to look at some pictures after this. But if we look at here's our numbers, and I'll pause for just a few seconds. Okay, all right, so here we go with these numbers. We have 4/10, 13.2 square inch ribeye. And then we have a 550-pound carcass. We figure about 2% weight on the KPH, 2% kidney, pelvic, and heart fat on the weight of that amount of fat. So here we go to our practice session. Furthering along, here we go to a 3.0 is what we figure our PYG would be. Our ribeye area would take away from that because it's a larger size ribeye. And then we're going to go to hot carcass weight of -2. It's going to basically tell us a little trimmer type carcass. And we're also going to take away on our KPH. So if you minus all that, we have a PYG of 3. We expect this to be a yield grade of 1.8. So this is going to be a little bit trimmer of a carcass out there in the industry. Not the trimmest, but trimmer than what we've talked about before. So if you have any questions going over those equations, let me know. But those equations, you're not going to be asked to complete an equation, but I'm going to want you to regurgitate those equations to me on the exam. So just be sure you know those going forward. All right, so here's our yield grade 1 carcass. Very good carcass. If we look at the ribeye area and we look at where we would actually take our PYG measurement, right around in this area, I would not take it in this dip, because that dip is going to add 2 to 3 tenths. It's going to change our number. So we're going to go right above it, right? So we're going to try to take out some outlier out of the equation. But if we look at this carcass right here, fairly large ribeye area. If we look at the other side that's still intact, doesn't look really excessively fat. Now, it's not the best picture, but there's not a whole lot of fat right here over the loin and loin edge in this area. There is some fat up here over the hindquarters, probably just the way this animal was developed and was grown out. And that's the thing. Every animal is going to look a lot different than each one. But here's our yield grade 1 carcass. Go to yield grade 2. We're going to have a little bit smaller ribeye area, a little bit more external fat right here where we get our PYG. Now, if we look at this carcass versus the previous one, there's less fat on the round, but if we look right here at this loin edge, there's a lot more fat that's going to be deposited there, and that's going to be indicative of a carcass that's going to have more fat on it over time. So here's our yield grade 3. We have a smaller ribeye area, quite a bit of external fat right here where we get our PYG. This is still very acceptable within the industry, and this is kind of the 2s and 3s are kind of where the industry wants to fall for the most part. But if we look, we get some fat right here on the loin and loin edge. If we look right up here, we call this the collar area, and over the round right here, that's actually what there's a little bit of fat there. And so instead of having maybe a Coke bottle shape, it's going to be more straight lines. We're not going to have much definition of shape. So we have to remember that fat fills in voids. Okay, so fat, as it deposits on the animal, is going to actually help smooth that animal out. So an animal that looks a lot more ripped up, more like a bodybuilder, is not going to have that much fat. But one looks a little more slick, more roly-poly, less defined lines. There's going to be more fat if we're trying to evaluate on a live scale. Here's a yield grade 4 carcass. Following along what we've been talking about, an excessive amount of fat right here where we measure our PYG. We have a larger ribeye area, or a smaller ribeye area right here, very indicative of this grade of carcass. And then if we look here, we're really losing that Coke bottle shape that we just talked about. So this is where we're starting to get too much fat for the carcass, because in the industry, when we harvest them and we go to process them after this stage, all that fat gets cut off. In the industry, when it leaves the harvesting facility in a processor, it is cut to a quarter of an inch of fat across the way. So all this extra fat, guess what? Low value product goes out the window, don't make near as much off that carcass. Now if we get to yield grade 5 carcass right here, these are excessively fat. We have a smaller ribeye area. We have all this fat right here. This dude right here is really fat. Now you never see this in a grocery store typically, okay? Because whenever they make the ribeye roll, they pull this out, and all the muscles basically from here to here roughly, they pull that out. Where you see this seam right here, that's actually what we call the cap, and that cap peels off super easy. It's a seam in there that flies off real easy. So it trims it up quite a bit, but that's still a lot of fat or a lot of corn in a nutritional sense that did not go to that animal actually putting it, one, in the ribeye area to increase quality grade, or two, to actually growing the animal and trying to grow more red meat product out there in the industry. So as you go through these, feel free to go back through them, look at the slide set that's up, and these are gonna basically just try to get a feel for what those carcasses look like. Now, I don't expect you to walk into a packing plant and know exactly what they are, but I want you to understand that yield grade 5s are excessively fat, yield grade 1s are trim, 2s and 3s are what are a lot more ideal for the industry, and then know about the equations, because the equation part, once you know the equations, it's all just plug and play. It's just like a math problem, right? You do all the equations, and you remember your please excuse my dear Aunt Sally for when you do what order of numbers, and then it all works out in the numbers, right? So it works out well. This system's been in place for a while, and people do 6,000 or 7,000 of these a day. So with practice, they're easy, right? You do them enough, just like riding a bike. You ride a bike enough, you're finally going to quit falling down on the ground, because maybe it hurts, or you just figure it out. So, but if y'all have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. Be glad to hear from y'all. Hope everything's going well and everybody's staying safe. Thank y'all very much. Take care.